Good morning. What I wanted to do today was to go over a little timeline about the space race that took place between the United States and, at the time, the Soviet Union. I thought this would be a great way to wrap up our discussion about the moon since it involves a race to the moon. Who was going to get there first? So don't mind me if I look at my notes here in the timeline, because typically we'd be doing this on the board in class. But just to get an idea of what the space race is, it was a 20th century competition between two Cold War rivals. And the Cold War began after World War II. It wasn't really a war of weapons, so it's not what we tend to think of when we think of a war. But it was between the United States and the Soviet Union to see who would come out on top for space flight capability, meaning who is going to make achievements in space the quickest and the biggest. And the peak came on July 20th, 1969, with the Apollo 11 mission you learned about, or the first moon landing. And I think we know that it was the United States who was the first to get there. But let's look back at some of the events that took place during this space race. So the first event that's important to note actually came from Russia on October 4th, 1957. And Sputnik, which was the first artificial satellite and the first man-made object put into space, was actually put into space by Russia. It was put into Earth's orbit. This was not something that was commanded by man, okay? It was just the first satellite in space put in there in orbit. And people all across the world went outside on that particular night and were able to see it streak across the sky. So at the beginning of the space race, it appeared like Russia had taken the first step towards beating us for that supremacy in space flight. From there, Sputnik 2 was sent into space. That was in November of 1957, so approximately a month after Sputnik 1. And what was interesting about Sputnik 2 is it put the first living organism in space. And believe it or not, this first living organism was a dog. And I believe I have some videos that will talk about this first organism in space. So if I can dig those up, I'll be sure to include those in today's lesson. So again, another win, if you would say, for Russia, or another advancement for Russia. Then in 1958, so nearly a year later, U.S. is going to appear on the scene, and we're going to finally launch our own satellite into space called the Explorer 1. And this happened underneath the supervision of President Eisenhower. Once again, this was not something that was manned by a person. It was just our first satellite, kind of our response to Sputnik 1 to show that we were capable of doing the same thing that Russia was. Following this, in 1959, Russia launched Lunar 1, which was a space shuttle that left Earth's orbit, followed by Lunar 2, which was the first space probe to hit the moon to send back some information about the moon. And then Luna 3, which photographed the moon. So Russia had 3 missions in a row, all to gain information about the moon. And think about it. These are important missions because you can't send a person to the moon without knowing those characteristics that you learned about this week. What the surface is like, what the gravity is like, what the temperature is like. Before man can go to the moon, man has to know what he's up against. So these 3 missions in a row, Lunar 1, Lunar 2, and Lunar 3, were all based on exploring the moon, photographing the moon, sending back pictures, sending back information to prepare for man to land on moon's surface in the future. In 1961, here comes Russia again with Yuri Gagarin. And he became the first person to orbit Earth traveling in a capsule made for just one person. This looks different than those multi-stage rockets you learned about yesterday. This was huge. United States wanted to be first and was very disappointed that Russia beat us to this. Now again, what Yuri did was he revolved around our planet. Okay, so he did not go to the moon, but this was huge. May 5th, 1961, the U.S. fires back, and Alan Shepard now becomes the first American in space, but not in orbit. So unlike Yuri Gagarin, who orbited Earth, Alan Shepard did not, but it was the first time we had put a human in space. Excuse me while I organize here. February 1962, the United States finally was able to match what Yuri Gagarin did. And John Glenn was the astronaut that was the first to orbit Earth, the first American astronaut to orbit Earth. So again, we had Yuri Gagarin first, who was a Russian, and they called them cosmonauts in Russia, Russian cosmonaut to orbit Earth. Then we put Alan Shepard in space, but he wasn't successful in orbiting the Earth. And John Glenn in 1962 became the first American astronaut to orbit Earth. The end of 1962, we launched the Apollo program. And the Apollo program, as you know from the past few days, was dedicated to sending man to the moon. So all of these missions had to do with that final goal of being the first to send man to the moon. 1963, this is pretty interesting. Ladies, listen up. Russia was the first to send a woman into space, and not only a female, but she was a civilian, meaning she wasn't a cosmonaut, she wasn't an astronaut, she wasn't part of their space program. So it was kind of two achievements in one. So they were ahead of their time with that. 1965, Russia, here it comes again, first spacewalk in history. Now, a spacewalk is when you leave the shuttle, but you're tethered or you're attached to it, because we know there's no gravity there, so you'd float away. But they leave the shuttle attached to it or tethered to it and perform their first spacewalk. So again, another big achievement by Russia. January 1967, Russia, again, but instead of a triumph, a tragedy. And a lot of people say that this would be the turning point in this Cold War, in this race to be the first to the moon. Their chief Soviet engineer died, and this was a huge setback for the Russians with the death of this Soviet engineer. January 1967, so same year, the Apollo program also had a setback when 3 astronauts were killed during a launch simulation. During the simulation, a fire broke out and the hatch was broken, so the astronauts could not escape the simulator and unfortunately burned in that simulation. So both Russia and the United States within that same year had tragedies which set them all back. December 1968, here comes the United States with the launch of Apollo 8. This was the first man-led mission to the moon. Again, the mission here wasn't to land on the moon, but more of a fact-finding mission, and again to see if a journey of that distance was actually possible. Sorry, I dropped my notes. That's why I disappeared for a moment. Here comes the U.S. again, July 16th, 1969. This is going to be our launch of Apollo 11, which is something we've been spending a lot of time on. So the 3 astronauts, Buzz Aldrin, Neil Armstrong, and Michael Collins, set out to reach the moon and to land on the moon on July 16th. And we know, or we should know, what happened on July 20th, 1969. That is going to be our first moon landing by the United States. So it appears that we came out victorious in this space race. Remember, it was Armstrong and Aldrin that walked on the moon, and Michael Collins was in charge of the shuttle, and he remained orbiting the moon, waiting for their return, where they could reconnect and go back to Earth. Between 1969 and 1972, so the period where we had launched the successful mission to land on the moon, the Apollo 11, The Russians had failed attempts to launch their lunar craft, and they had one explosion in 1969. So while Russia kind of started out strong and surged ahead, the death of their chief Soviet engineer caused them some major setbacks, and the United States was able to surge forward and become successful with their first mission to the moon. So when you hear them talk about the space race, that's really the timeline of events. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to include, after today's video, a typed out timeline just so you can see the events and you can follow along if you'd like as I'm speaking in the video. And I'm also going to try to include a video that goes over the space race again and shows you some of those things that I mentioned in here. So I thought it was a fantastic way to wrap up our series on the moon. And where we're going to head from here is continuing a little exploration of space and talk about some disasters in space. So after the break that we have, we're going to talk a little bit about the Challenger and about the Space Shuttle Columbia. These were two disasters, unfortunately, to the program, not the Apollo program, but our space program. So I hope you enjoyed learning a little bit about the space race. I hope you enjoyed the video that I'm going to include. All of these are historical moments, and it's not often that we get to step away from the curriculum and follow our interests. So why not do it now and learn a little bit about things that we were interested in during the course of the year? Enjoy. Don't forget to mark as done when you finish the videos.